Frank Donahue woke up at exactly 6 a.m., just as he had every weekday for the past 30 years. Without opening his eyes, he reached his right side, but the bed was empty. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint scent of perfume told him that Elizabeth was already up. Frank smiled. In all the years they had been together, his wife had never once let him leave for work without preparing him breakfast. He swung his legs out of bed and made his way down the wooden stairs of their two-story Victorian home. It was the most beautiful house in Oak Ridge, a small town with only 3,800 residents. Yet, Frank and Elizabeth Donahue were regarded as the local elite. He served as the sheriff of the county, while she owned the best house in town and organized charity events. "Good morning, dear," Elizabeth greeted him as he entered the kitchen. She was standing at the stove, looking elegant even in her silk robe. At 57, she appeared 10 years younger. Her slim figure, perfectly styled blonde hair in a casual bun, and flawless posture made her seem ageless. "Good morning, sweetheart," Frank replied, walking over to kiss her on the cheek. "Up at the crack of dawn again. I thought I'd finish my composition for the evening event at the library," Elizabeth explained. "You remember, it's the charity event tonight." Frank nodded, though he would likely have forgotten if she hadn't reminded him. Unlike the ever-organized Elizabeth, Frank had become a little more absent-minded over the years. Still, that didn't affect his ability to be the best sheriff Oak Ridge had ever seen. Breakfast was perfect, as always, scrambled eggs with herbs, toast, and coffee just the right strength. They ate their meal on the veranda, overlooking the meticulously kept garden, a testament to Elizabeth's impeccable taste. Every flower bed, every shrub was carefully tended to. "Dave's been poking around again," Frank said with a grin. "He asked about your beauty secret." Elizabeth smiled, though there was a tension in her expression. "Tell him the secret is a happy marriage. When you wake up 30 years later with a man who looks at you like you're the eighth wonder of the world, you don't need beauticians." They met in Denver 32 years ago. Frank, then a young police officer, had noticed Elizabeth at a charity ball. She stood out not because of flashy beauty, but because of a unique grace and confidence. It took 2 months of courtship to secure a first date, and another 6 months before he proposed. Elizabeth shared a little about her past, growing up in an orphanage, never knowing her parents, and having only one relative, her brother Robert, with whom she had lost touch long ago. Frank never pressed her for more details. Everyone had their secrets, especially if they were painful. A year after their marriage, they moved to Oak Ridge, where Frank was offered a position as a deputy sheriff. Elizabeth supported him, even though it meant leaving a prestigious job at a design firm. She quickly made a name for herself in the small town, transforming their home into a cultural center. "Are you going to be late tonight?" Elizabeth asked as she picked up the dishes. "I'll try to be back by 6 o'clock so I can make it to your event," Frank answered, donning his sheriff's hat. "Unless something happens in Oak Ridge, which is rare." The last murder was 5 years ago when Farmer Johnson shot his neighbor over a boundary dispute. He kissed Elizabeth goodbye and left for the service pickup. As he drove down Main Street, he waved to the familiar faces of the townspeople. In Oak Ridge, everyone knew each other, and the Donahues were universally respected. At the station, Dave Miller, Frank's deputy and friend for 25 years, was already there. "Coffee?" Dave asked, offering a mug. "No thanks, just had breakfast," Frank replied, hanging his hat and sitting down at his desk to review the reports from the night before. "Anything interesting?" Dave inquired. "It's all routine," Frank said. But as he sat there, the nagging feeling that something was about to happen lingered at the back of his mind. Oak Ridge was a small, quiet town, but even here, surprises could arise when least expected. It was a typical quiet day in Oak Ridge. The most excitement came from Mrs. Parker, who was once again complaining about the teenagers hanging out at the supermarket. Frank, however, went through his usual routine. He checked the patrol cars, had a brief meeting with his subordinates, and then headed to the local school for a preventative talk. After lunch, he made his way to City Hall to discuss the budget for the upcoming quarter. He got home earlier than usual, around 5 p.m., with the intention of surprising Elizabeth. But when he pulled into the driveway, something struck him as odd. Her car wasn't there. Normally, before events, she spent the whole day at home, getting ready. Frank frowned as he approached the door. It felt strange. Using his key, he unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. "Elizabeth," he called out, but the house was eerily quiet. The only thing waiting for him was a note on the kitchen table. He picked it up and read, "How to make an emergency trip to Denver to get material for the composition. Be back by 6 o'clock. Dinner's in the oven. Kisses." Denver was an hour away. It was odd that she hadn't called. Frank dialed her number on his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He shrugged, dismissing it for the moment, and went upstairs to change. That evening, as expected, Elizabeth was the shining star of the charity event at the library. No one would have suspected that. Even while hosting, she had been distracted and on edge for the past 2 weeks. Frank had noticed it too. The restless movements, the distant look in her eyes, the late-night phone calls and hushed tones. At first, he chalked it up to stress or fatigue, but today's sudden trip to Denver left him uneasy. "Your Elizabeth has outdone herself again," said Jack Morrison, Frank's longtime friend and neighbor, as he clapped him on the shoulder. "Look how beautiful everything is." The centerpiece of the table was an elegant arrangement of fresh flowers and dried herbs, so artistically arranged that they almost seemed to dance in the air. "I can't take my eyes off it," said Susan, Jack's wife, admiring the display. "Talent," Frank replied simply, a touch of pride in his voice as he watched Elizabeth effortlessly mingle with the guests. Bill Carpenter, the local restaurant owner, approached him. "Your wife is a real treasure, Sheriff. She's only gotten more beautiful over the years. I swear she doesn't age." Frank nodded, agreeing with him. It was true. Elizabeth took exceptional care of herself. Regular exercise, good nutrition, and yes, the cosmetic procedures they could afford. After all, the sheriff's salary wasn't bad, and Elizabeth worked part-time as an interior designer. The evening was a success. Elizabeth raised a record $188,000 for the children's ward at the local hospital. Frank couldn't have been prouder of his wife, but as they drove home, a vague unease settled in his chest. "So, how was your trip to Denver?" he asked casually, as they prepared for bed. Elizabeth froze for a moment before answering. "It was fine. The flower store almost let me down, but I managed to get everything. You could have called. I would have gone with you." "It was too spontaneous," she said quickly, changing in her nightgown and slipping under the covers. "I'm tired. Let's just go to sleep." Frank, sensing her discomfort, decided not to push. But her behavior was unusual for the woman he had spent the last 30 years falling asleep next to every night. Over the next few days, Frank kept a close eye on Elizabeth. She tried her best to act normal, but he could tell something was off. Twice, he noticed her whispering on the phone. When she saw him, she quickly ended the calls. On Friday, Frank came home early again. As he walked through the door, he heard the phone ring. Elizabeth was in the shower, so he picked up the receiver. "Donahue Residence," he answered. A man's voice came through, asking for Elizabeth. "It's me. I have the results. We need to talk." Frank's heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry, but this is her husband. Elizabeth can't come to the phone right now." There was a long pause before the man stammered, sorry, wrong number," and quickly hung up. When Elizabeth came downstairs, Frank told her about the strange call. Some man called, talking about some results. He said, his tone casual, but his mind racing. Elizabeth turned pale, but quickly recovered. "Oh, it must be the debt collectors. They've been calling the wrong number again. That's the 3rd time this month." She shrugged and changed the subject. "What are we doing this weekend?" "Jack invited us over for a barbecue." Frank nodded, deciding not to press the issue any further. Maybe all of these little things were just coincidences, but his gut told him otherwise. Something was happening, and Elizabeth was hiding it from him. His intuition was nagging at him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The phone call, the secretive trips, the late-night whispering, it was all adding up to something he couldn't yet understand. Frank had always trusted his instincts, honed over 25 years on the force, but something was telling him that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Despite the nagging feeling, they went ahead with the Morrison's barbecue on Saturday. Jack, a former military doctor and now a consultant at a local clinic, manned the grill, serving up steaks while regaling the group with stories from his practice. Meanwhile, Susan and Elizabeth chatted about a new school program. Susan, a teacher, always had insightful thoughts to share. The evening was warm, and the company was pleasant, but Frank couldn't seem to shake the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. He noticed Elizabeth flinch when her phone buzzed on the table. She quickly excused herself, stepping into the garden to take the call. When she returned 5 minutes later, she was visibly pale. "Is everything all right?" Frank asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just a client about a design project. We'll have to go to Denver next week," she replied, brushing it off with a smile. But Frank noticed Jack's curious glance at Elizabeth, a doctor's instinct to notice when something is amiss. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though Frank found it hard to relax. They got home late, and Elizabeth immediately went upstairs, claiming she had a headache. Frank stayed behind, sitting in the living room, torn between confronting her and letting it slide for the moment. But something was clearly wrong, and Elizabeth was hiding it from him. He waited a half hour before going upstairs, quietly entering their bedroom. Elizabeth was already lying down, or at least pretending to be. He could hear her steady breathing, but there was the phone on her bedside table, almost like a silent invitation to discover what she was hiding. Frank knew he shouldn't pry, but the anxiety gnawed at him. He reached for the phone, careful not to wake her. The screen was locked, but a new message notification caught his eye. His heart skipped when he saw the text. "Robert, results confirmed. Time is short. We need to talk." The message ended abruptly, and Frank's mind raced. Robert? Her brother, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. He set the phone back down slowly, trying to breathe through the shock. Lying back down beside Elizabeth, he could sense that she wasn't asleep. He wanted to ask her everything right then and there, but instead, he decided to wait. He would talk to her tomorrow. Whatever was going on, they would face it together, just like they always had. But the next morning, Elizabeth was up before him and gone before he had a chance to talk to her. There was only a note on the kitchen counter, urgently called to Denver. "I'll be back tonight. Don't worry, love." Frank stared at the note, his heart heavy. The perfect life they had built over 30 years was suddenly fractured, and he had no idea why. That afternoon, Elizabeth returned, looking exhausted but trying to mask it with a smile. Frank was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch a baseball game, though he wasn't focused on the screen at all. He heard the door open, and a sense of relief washed over him as Elizabeth entered the room. "Hi," she said, her voice tired. "Sorry for the sudden departure. Is everything okay?" Frank asked, immediately sensing that something was off. He turned off the TV and looked at her closely. "You look a little pale." Elizabeth sat down on the couch beside him and let out a deep breath. "We need to talk," she said, her tone making Frank's stomach tighten with anxiety. He nodded, bracing himself for whatever was coming. They had been through a lot in their marriage, financial struggles, the loss of his parents, difficult moves, but they had always weathered the storms together. He convinced himself that whatever it was, they would get through this too. "I have to go to the hospital," Elizabeth said, her gaze focused on her hands. Frank's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" "Kidney problems," she said, looking up at him. "It's nothing fatal, don't worry. Just need some procedures." "What kind of procedures? Why didn't you say anything? When did it start?" Elizabeth smiled weakly. "I didn't want to worry you prematurely. I had the checkup 2 weeks ago when I went to get materials for the fundraiser. I was told the results today." Frank reached for her hands, holding them tightly. "We'll go together. I'll take a vacation. Dave can handle a few days without me." "No, Frank," she answered quickly, shaking her head. "That won't be necessary. The procedure is simple, and it'll only take a few days. Besides, you have an important meeting with the district attorney on Wednesday." "To hell with the meeting," Frank exclaimed, his frustration mounting. "This is about your health. We'll take care of everything else later." Elizabeth remained calm, but Frank could feel the distance growing between them. There was more to this story, and Elizabeth wasn't telling him everything. He couldn't shake the feeling that her trip to Denver and the strange phone calls were tied to whatever was happening with her health, and that it wasn't as simple as she was letting on. For the first time in their marriage, Frank felt as though the walls he had built around their life together were crumbling, and he was standing helplessly as the cracks widened. Elizabeth squeezed Frank's hand gently. "Please, Frank, I'll feel better if you stay here and mind your own business." "I'll be in touch," she insisted, her tone firm yet weary. They argued for another half-hour, but Elizabeth was resolute. Eventually, Frank gave in, though the strange insistence on her part raised alarms in his mind. This wasn't like her at all. Why was she so determined to refuse his support? "When do you have to go?" he asked, his voice betraying the unease he was trying to suppress. "Wednesday," Elizabeth answered, looking away for a moment. "I've already made arrangements with Dr. Pfizer. He's an old friend of my doctor in Denver." Frank noticed the brief hesitation in her voice, but decided not to press the issue. Elizabeth looked incredibly tired, and he thought better than to push her further. They went upstairs, and for the first time in days, his wife fell asleep in his arms. The next evening, Frank came home early, eager to check on Elizabeth, only to find her talking on the phone outside in the backyard. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but as he approached the porch door, he couldn't help but overhear a snippet of the conversation. "All set. Dr. Pfizer says the odds are good. Yes, I know the risks, but there's no other way. Of course, Robert, I love you too." Elizabeth hung up and stood motionless for a few moments, staring off into space. Frank quietly stepped back and walked through the front door, slamming it loudly as he entered to make his presence known. "I'm home," he called out, his voice a little sharper than usual. In the kitchen, Elizabeth's voice responded from the other room. When Frank walked in, Elizabeth was standing by the stove, as if she had been cooking dinner the whole time. Her cheeks were flushed, but otherwise, she appeared calm. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to sound normal. "The usual," Frank replied, his eyes not leaving her face. "And you?" "I packed for the hospital and arranged for Susan to take care of the flowers," she answered, her tone slightly too rehearsed. Dinner passed in relative silence, the tension in the air palpable. Afterward, they sat on the veranda, sipping tea and gazing at the stars, a long-standing tradition they had maintained throughout their marriage. "Do you remember our first night in this house?" Elizabeth asked, breaking the quiet. "We sat here until dawn and dreamed of our future." Frank nodded, his hand finding hers. "You said you wanted to grow old on this veranda, holding my hands. And I haven't changed my mind." Elizabeth smiled, squeezing his palm. "Whatever happens, Frank, know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me." There was an odd finality in her voice, a note of farewell that lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. It kept Frank awake all night, his mind racing with thoughts and questions he couldn't quite answer. The next morning, Frank walked Elizabeth to her car. She was carrying a small suitcase, just the bare essentials for her trip. "I'll call you when I get there," she promised, kissing him on the cheek. "Don't worry about me. Call me directly from the hospital," Frank urged. "And tell me the name of the clinic and the room number, just in case." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay, I will." As soon as her car was around the corner, Frank went back inside. The unease gnawing at him refused to let go. Why was she so insistent on driving alone? What was this kidney procedure she kept mentioning? And why was her brother, Robert, whom she hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly involved? He went into his office and turned on his computer, his mind racing. He opened the browser history, knowing that Elizabeth rarely cleared it. In the recent searches, he saw things that stopped him cold. Kidney transplant, close relative compatibility, risks of kidney donation. Elizabeth was planning to donate a kidney, but to whom? The pieces clicked together, and Frank's heart sank. She was going to give her kidney to Robert. But why was she hiding this from him? The phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. "I made it." Elizabeth's voice came through a little strained. "Already at the hospital. I'm checking in now." "What's the name of the clinic?" Frank asked, trying to steady his nerves. There was a brief pause. "Denver Memorial Medical Center, Nephrology Department." "Room number?" "I don't know yet. They'll tell me after I check in." "Call me as soon as you know," Frank insisted. "Okay," she sighed. "Frank, I love you. Please don't worry. Everything's going to be okay." The call ended, but Frank sat there, the phone still in his hand, his mind racing. Something was terribly wrong, and he could feel it deep in his gut. Back at the station, Dave, his longtime deputy, noticed Frank's distracted state. "Is something wrong?" he asked, noticing Frank check his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. "Elizabeth's in the hospital," Frank replied, trying to hide his concern. But the weight of his suspicion hung heavily in the air. Something was not right, and he wasn't going to rest until he figured out what. Frank's heart raced as he paced in his office. The call from Elizabeth, which she had promised earlier, never came. By lunchtime, the anxiety gnawing at him grew unbearable, and he couldn't wait any longer. Dialing her number, he was met with the cold, frustrating silence of a phone that had been switched off. That was the final straw. Something was wrong, and his gut told him he couldn't ignore it any longer. "Dave, I have to leave," Frank said, walking into his deputy's office. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable urgency in his tone. "Can you take over until tomorrow?" Dave looked at him, concern flashing in his eyes. "Sure, Frank. Go to Elizabeth. Nothing's going to happen in the city." With a silent nod, Frank quickly changed into civilian clothes, his mind clouded with worry. The familiar weight of his sheriff's uniform lifted off him as he dressed, but the weight of his concern for Elizabeth remained. He grabbed his keys and headed for his black Ford, the one they'd bought 3 years ago. The drive to Denver Memorial Medical Center would take a little over an hour, but Frank couldn't focus on the time. His thoughts were entirely with Elizabeth. The medical center was a sprawling complex of modern buildings in the heart of Denver. Frank parked his car and rushed toward the main entrance, the cool breeze doing little to calm the tension in his chest. Inside, he approached the information desk, where a young woman greeted him with a polite smile. "Hello," Frank began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm looking for a patient, Elizabeth Donahue. She was supposed to be admitted to the nephrology department today." The woman tapped away at the computer, her face changing slightly as she looked at the screen. "I'm sorry, I don't see a patient by that name in our system," she said, her voice apologetic. Frank's heart dropped. "Please check again," he insisted, trying to keep his cool. "She should definitely be here. Maybe it hasn't been entered into the system yet." The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm afraid there are only 3 patients admitted to the nephrology department today, and Elizabeth Donahue isn't one of them. Could it be another clinic?" Frank thought to himself. "Could you check for a patient named Robert Clark?" he asked quickly, the hunch forming in his mind. "He might have been admitted today." The woman typed again, and after a moment, she nodded. "Yes, Robert Clark was admitted this morning to the transplant unit on the 5th floor, room 512. A sense of realization washed over Frank. He knew Elizabeth was involved somehow, but this confirmed it. She was going to donate a kidney, but why hadn't she told him? Why had she lied? He thanked the woman and quickly made his way to the 5th floor, his mind racing. The hallway was quiet, nurses moving briskly between rooms. When he reached room 512, he knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," a man's voice answered from within. Frank entered and saw a thin man in a hospital bed, looking slightly pale but otherwise composed. He looked almost like Elizabeth, blonde hair, similar features, but the likeness was subtle. This had to be Robert Clark. "Robert Clark?" Frank asked, his voice steady but laced with frustration. The man looked surprised. "Yes, and you are?" "Frank Donahue, Elizabeth's husband," Frank replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Robert's face turned a shade paler. "Oh, I didn't know you were coming." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Elizabeth didn't tell me she was coming either. She said she was here herself for kidney problems." Robert looked visibly embarrassed. "It's hard to explain," he muttered, avoiding Frank's gaze. "Try me," Frank insisted, sitting down in the chair beside the bed. "I have to understand. Is Elizabeth donating a kidney to you?" Robert nodded, his eyes now filled with quiet remorse. "Yes, I'm in kidney failure. Dialysis isn't working anymore. Without a transplant, I wouldn't have more than a year to live." Frank's mind raced, but he managed to keep his composure. "And you found Elizabeth after all these years?" Robert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Actually, we never lost touch," he admitted. "We just didn't see each other much." This was news to Frank. Elizabeth had always said she had no contact with her brother. "Why hide it?" Frank asked, confusion spreading. "Why not tell me?" Robert shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with how to explain. She knew you'd be against it, he said quietly. She didn't want you to worry. The donation is risky, especially at our age. Frank's frustration deepened. I wouldn't have stopped her from helping her brother, he countered. But I have a right to know what's going on with my wife. Robert looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. Of course you do. It's just complicated. Where is she now? Frank asked, trying to push forward. She's in pre-op. The surgery's tomorrow, Robert replied, his voice tinged with guilt. Frank's heart sank. Why didn't she tell me the truth? Robert's voice softened. She knew how you'd react. She didn't want to make it harder for you. Frank leaned forward, his voice firm. But I have a right to know. I'm her husband. Right, Robert said, his voice soft but firm. It's just that Elizabeth. She's always been very independent, and she loves you very much. She didn't want to bother you. Frank studied the man's face, a vague sense of familiarity creeping up on him, though he was certain he had never met Elizabeth's brother before. How long have you known about your illness? Frank asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. I was diagnosed 3 years ago, Robert replied, his gaze drifting to the window. It wasn't so bad at first, but in the last few months, it has worsened dramatically. And Elizabeth knew all this time? Frank pressed, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. No, Robert said, shaking his head. I only told her 2 weeks ago, when it became clear that the transplant was necessary. Why her? Frank asked, the question hanging in the air. Aren't there other donors? Robert looked at Frank with a slight surprise. There are 2 other options, he said, but her kidney is a perfect match because we're identical twins. Frank frowned, struggling to process the information. Identical? I never would have guessed. You two don't look alike at all. Robert shrugged nonchalantly. Genes are a strange thing, Mr. Donahue. Just then, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Are you related to the patient? She asked, her tone polite but firm. I'm his brother-in-law, Frank replied, his voice quiet but tense. Elizabeth's husband. Mr. Clark needs to rest before his surgery tomorrow, the nurse said, her voice crisp. You can come back tomorrow. Sure, Frank nodded, standing. Can you tell me where my wife is right now? Elizabeth Donahue. She's a donor for Mr. Clark. The donors are in another wing, the nurse replied. I'm afraid it's off limits right now because of the risk of infection. You'll be able to see her tomorrow after the operation. Frank sighed, realizing it was pointless to argue. Please tell her I'm here, okay? And that I love her. I will, the nurse said with a smile before walking away. Frank stood there, staring at Robert, who had already turned his gaze to the window. Get well soon, Frank said, though his voice was more distant than he intended. Leaving the hospital, Frank got into his car, his mind whirling with questions. Why had Elizabeth lied about her brother all these years? Why hide the fact that she was going to donate her kidney? And what about that statement about identical twins? Despite all the confusion, Frank was relieved that everything had finally been explained. His wife just wanted to save her brother without dragging him into the story. He could understand that, but something still felt off. He decided to stay in Denver for the night, checking into a small hotel near the hospital. As he tried to sleep, his thoughts refused to settle, swirling with questions about the woman he thought he knew so well. But one thing was certain. Tomorrow, he would see Elizabeth, and no matter what secrets she was keeping, they would face them together. The next morning, Frank was at the hospital by 8 a.m. The surgery was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and he had hoped to see Elizabeth before she was wheeled into the operating room. But once again, the hospital's rules prevented him from doing so. I just want to support my wife before the surgery, Frank insisted to the charge nurse, his frustration mounting. I understand your concern, the nurse said kindly, but the preoperative preparations have already started. You'll be able to see your wife after the operation in the recovery room. With a heavy heart, Frank gave in and settled into the waiting area. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. He flipped through old magazines, occasionally glanced out the window, but his thoughts always returned to Elizabeth. Around noon, the same nurse approached him. Mr. Donahue, the operation was a success. Your wife is now in the recovery room. She's not fully awake yet, but you can visit her now. Relief flooded Frank's chest as he followed the nurse down a long corridor. She stopped at a door, giving him a warning. Just don't tire her out. 15 minutes, no more. Frank nodded and entered the room. Elizabeth was lying in the bed, pale but alive. She looked tired, but there was a soft smile on her face when she saw him. "Hello," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with warmth. "You made it." "Of course I did," Frank replied, walking over and taking her hand. "How could I not have come?" "I didn't want you to worry," she said softly. "I met with Robert," Frank said, sitting beside her. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, her breath shallow. "It's hard to explain." "We'll have time," Frank said, his hand gently brushing her cheek. "You rest now. I'm not going anywhere." A week passed since the surgery, and Elizabeth was recovering faster than the doctors had anticipated. Robert's condition was also improving. Frank had taken 2 weeks off to care for his wife, and now they were back home in Oak Ridge. The evening air was warm, and Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The fragrance of blossoming apple trees filled the air as Frank sat on the veranda, watching the final rays of the sun color the horizon in golden hues. Elizabeth was resting upstairs, having taken a painkiller. She had been quiet and brooding for the past few days, attributing it to fatigue from the surgery, but Frank could sense it was something deeper. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made him turn his head. Jack Morrison, waving a six-pack of beer, was heading toward the veranda. "Thought I'd check on the heroine of the day," he said with a grin. "How's she sleeping?" Frank looked at his friend, his expression weary. "The doctors say she's recovering well, but she still needs rest." "Then we'll keep it quiet," Jack said, settling down in a nearby chair and handing Frank a beer. "To your wife's health." They clinked their cans together, and Frank took a sip, letting the cool beer relax him. As he leaned back, the tension of the past few days began to ease. "You know, it never ceases to amaze me," Frank said, staring off into the distance. All these years, Elizabeth claimed she had little contact with her brother, and it turns out they've been in touch all along. "People hide strange things sometimes," Jack shrugged. "Maybe there were some things between them she didn't want to talk about." Frank nodded slowly. "Robert seems like a nice guy. It's just odd that they don't look alike at all, even though he claims they're identical twins." Jack, who had just taken a sip, suddenly choked, his eyes wide with surprise. "I'm sorry, what?" he managed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Identical twins. Brother and sister," Frank said, looking at his friend with a puzzled expression. "What's the big deal?" Jack put his beer down on the table, his face taking on a serious expression. "Frank, that's impossible. Identical twins are always the same sex. It's when one fertilized egg splits into 2 genetically identical embryos. A brother and sister can never be identical twins." Frank's brows furrowed. "Are you sure?" "Positive. It's basic medicine. Ask any first-year medical student." Jack's tone was unwavering. A chill crept into Frank's stomach. Why would Robert lie? Or was he simply ignorant about medical matters? Maybe he'd just gotten the terms mixed up, Frank thought, unwilling to consider other, darker possibilities. "Not everyone knows the terminology," Frank suggested. "Maybe," Jack agreed, but doubt was evident in his eyes. "But it's strange to hear that from someone who's about to undergo an organ transplant. They usually explain things like that in great detail." The conversation shifted to other topics: work, baseball, the latest city news, but Jack's words lingered in Frank's mind like a splinter. By the time Jack left, the sky had darkened, and Frank went upstairs to check on Elizabeth. She was still asleep, her face serene under the faint night light. She almost looked youthful again, her features soft and peaceful. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. 30 years of marriage, and now this? He went downstairs to his office and powered up his computer. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing "identical twins" into the search engine. He scrolled through the results, and it became clear Jack was right. Identical twins were always the same sex. It was a scientific fact, without exception. So why had Robert said they were identical? Was it a mistake or was it a lie? And if it was a lie, why? Frank leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the puzzle pieces he couldn't quite fit together. His mind wandered back to the strange behavior Elizabeth had displayed in recent years. She never spoke about her childhood, always avoiding that part of her life. He'd always assumed it was due to painful memories from her time in the orphanage. But what if there was more to it than that? Frank spent the rest of the night awake, tossing and turning on the couch in the living room so he wouldn't disturb Elizabeth. Thoughts swirled in his head, sharp and relentless, like vultures circling overhead. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, he made a decision. He needed to talk to Robert again, face to face, without Elizabeth. "I'm going grocery shopping," Frank told Elizabeth over breakfast. "Do you need anything?" "No, thanks," Elizabeth replied, her voice softer than usual. She looked better than the day before, but was still pale. "Just don't stay too long. I don't like being alone." Frank's chest tightened. It was a lie. In 30 years of marriage, Elizabeth had never complained about being alone. She treasured those hours when she could be by herself, gathering her thoughts. This was yet another oddity to add to the growing list of suspicions. He kissed her forehead and left the house, walking toward his car. Instead of heading to the supermarket, he drove straight for the highway leading to Denver. His service weapon was holstered at his side, the weight of it reassuring him that he was doing the right thing. Whatever secrets Elizabeth was keeping, he would get to the bottom of them. And once he did, they would face them together, just like they always had. As sheriff, Frank was authorized to carry his weapon even when off duty. He typically left the gun at home, but today, something urged him to take it with him. The drive to Denver seemed to fly by, his mind consumed with thoughts of the upcoming conversation with Robert. What would he say? How would Robert react to a direct question? And, if his suspicions were confirmed, how would Frank handle the truth? He parked outside the hospital and walked toward the entrance with a purposeful stride. He knew where to find Robert. Room 512. The door was ajar, and Robert was sitting on the bed, flipping through some papers. He looked much better than he had the week before. "Mr. Donahue," Robert said, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "I didn't expect to see you." "We need to talk," Frank said, his voice steady. He closed the door behind him and took a seat. "About you and Elizabeth," Frank began. Robert stiffened, but he tried to maintain a nonchalant expression. "Of course. How is she, by the way?" "The doctor said the surgery went well." "She's recovering," Frank replied briefly. Then he got to the point. "I want you to explain something to me. Last time, you said you and Elizabeth were identical twins. Is that true?" Robert visibly paled, his eyes widening. "Yes, of course. We were born on the same day, in the same womb." But Frank cut him off. "That's not what I meant," Frank said, his voice tight. "Identical twins are always the same sex. Always. It's a scientific fact. So how can you and Elizabeth be identical twins?" There was a long pause. Robert stared at his hands, clenching and unclenching his fingers. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You're right," he said softly. "We can't be identical twins of different sexes, because we're not. Or rather, we weren't from the beginning." Frank's mind spun, the words barely registering at first. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking with confusion. Robert met Frank's gaze, his eyes filled with a determination that suggested he was finally releasing a long-held secret. "We were born boys, identical male twins. Edward and Robert Clark." Edward later became Elizabeth. Frank's world tilted. The room seemed to fade away as Robert's words hit him like a thunderclap. "You're lying," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," Robert shook his head. "I would never have told you this secret if you hadn't figured it out yourself. Elizabeth, she's come a long way. Hormone therapy, surgeries, that was before you even met her. She wanted to start a new life, to be her real self." Frank staggered back, his mind racing. 30 years. His voice trembled as he tried to process the enormity of it. 30 years she lied to me. "She didn't lie," Robert said gently. "She just didn't talk about the past that hurt her. Elizabeth has always been a woman inside, just born in the wrong body." Frank stood up, his legs unsteady, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't hear anymore. "Where is she now?" Robert asked anxiously. Frank cut him off. "None of your business," he said coldly, walking out of the room. He slammed the door behind him, his heart racing, his mind reeling. In the hallway, Frank leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. 30 years of his life had been built on lies. The woman he had loved The woman he had dedicated his life to was a man. It couldn't be true. This had to be some sort of nightmare. But deep down, he knew Robert was telling the truth. There were too many things that didn't add up. Elizabeth's reluctance to talk about her childhood, her avoidance of certain aspects of their intimate life. It all made sense now. Frank walked out of the hospital and got into his car. His hands trembled so badly that he could barely get the key into the ignition. One thought pulsed in his mind: go home and demand an explanation. The drive back took less than an hour, but the entire time, Frank tried to calm himself, to find a rational explanation. But the anger, the sense of betrayal, only grew. He parked in front of the house and sat motionless for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then, he got out of the car and walked toward the front door. Elizabeth was sitting in the living room, reading a book. When she saw the look on his face, she turned pale and put the book aside. "Frank, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. But it was clear in her eyes that she already knew the answer. "I talked to Robert," Frank said, his voice cold and detached. "He told me the truth about you, about both of you." Elizabeth closed her eyes, as if in physical pain. "Frank, is it true?" Frank interrupted, taking a step forward. "Tell me right now, were you born a man?" She nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "Yes, but I've always been a woman inside." Frank's mind reeled. He could feel his entire world shifting beneath him. The woman he had spent his life with, the person he had built everything with, wasn't who he thought she was. It was too much to process, too much to bear. For the first time in 30 years, Frank didn't know what to say. Something inside Frank shivered as the realization hit him. Robert hadn't lied. 30 years, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. 30 years, you've been deceiving me. I didn't lie, Elizabeth said, rising from the couch cautiously due to her recent surgery. I just didn't tell you about a past that didn't matter anymore. Didn't matter? Fury surged within him. You think it doesn't matter to me? That my wife. Frank couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. I'm the same woman you fell in love with 32 years ago, Elizabeth said softly, trying to remain calm. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. Frank shouted, his face contorted with rage. My whole life has been built on lies. He felt his hand reach instinctively for his holster, fingers wrapping around the grip of his gun. The weapon was drawn before he fully realized what he was doing. When Elizabeth saw the gun, she froze. Frank, she said quietly, her voice trembling, put the gun down. Let's talk calmly. How can I talk calmly? His hand with the gun was shaking. Do you realize what you've done to me? My whole life. I realize you need time. Elizabeth's voice was strained but controlled. You're shocked. That's normal. But Frank, we can get through this together. Together? He laughed bitterly. Do you really think we can stay together after this? I don't know, Elizabeth answered honestly, her voice soft. But I do know that the last 30 years have not been a lie. What we had between us was real. Frank shook his head, unable to accept her words. At that moment, it wasn't just the collapse of his marriage. His entire reality, everything he believed to be true, was crumbling around him. Why, he asked hoarsely. Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? I was afraid, Elizabeth replied simply. Afraid of losing you. And then it was too late. The gun in Frank's hand felt heavy, but he couldn't bring himself to put it down. It was the only thing keeping him anchored in a world that had suddenly lost all clarity. Something tangible, something real. You should have told me, he said. I had a right to know. Yes, she agreed quietly. You're right, and I've wanted it many times, but each time I couldn't find the strength. Elizabeth took a slow step forward, holding out her hand. Frank, please put the gun down. Stay back, he warned, backing away from her. I don't know what to do, Frank whispered, tears filling his eyes. Not just from the pain of betrayal, but from the crushing realization that he still loved this woman. And that was the worst part. I know you feel cheated, Elizabeth continued softly. But think of everything we've been through together. Didn't it mean anything to you? Frank looked at her, at the face he had kissed 1,000 times, at the hands that had held him through moments of despair, at the eyes that had always held so much love. Gradually, his anger began to give way to deep, agonizing confusion. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly. "I don't know who I am." "You're the same, Frank," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with reassurance. "And I'm the same Elizabeth. Nothing can change who we are now." Slowly, the gun in Frank's hand began to lower. Perhaps they could talk, perhaps, in time, they could work through this. But just then, a deafening explosion shattered the moment. A firecracker, set off by the neighborhood kids, went off right under the windows. Frank, trained by years of police work, reacted instinctively. His finger pulled the trigger involuntarily. The shot rang through the silence of the house, sharp and final. Elizabeth staggered, a red stain quickly spreading across her blouse. Her eyes filled with a mix of surprise and pain, and she collapsed to the floor. Frank's heart stopped. "No," he whispered, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. In a frantic panic, he threw the gun aside and rushed to her, falling to his knees beside her. He lifted her head gently, pressing his palm to the wound, trying to stop the blood from flowing. "Elizabeth, hold on," Frank cried, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. God, I didn't mean it." His hands were shaking as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with unsteady fingers. "I'm hurt," he whispered to the operator. "My wife, please hurry." Elizabeth stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, but she couldn't say anything. Only a faint moan escaped her lips. "Don't talk," Frank pleaded, pulling her close. "Help is on the way. Just hang on." But deep down, he knew it was too late. The bullet had gone straight through her heart. Blood seeped from the wound, staining her blouse, and Frank felt the life slipping away from her, slowly and cruelly. He held her in his arms, desperately wishing he could undo the nightmare that had unfolded, but he knew it was futile. She was slipping away, and nothing he could do would change it now. The blood soaked everything around him, staining the light-colored carpet with a deep red hue. Elizabeth squeezed his hand weakly, her lips forming silent words that might have been sorry or love. Then, the light in her eyes dimmed, and the hand Frank was holding grew limp. "No," he whispered, pulling her closer against him. "No, no, no." He sat there, holding his wife's lifeless body, as the police and paramedics arrived. He didn't resist when they dragged him away, handcuffing him, reading him his rights. He didn't feel anything anymore. At the station, Dave walked into the interrogation room, staring at Frank in disbelief and horror. "Frank, what happened?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "Elizabeth's dead," Frank said, his voice hollow. "I killed her, but I didn't mean to. It was an accident." "But why did you point a gun at her in the first place?" Dave asked, unable to understand how his longtime friend, a respected sheriff, could have done such a thing. Frank's eyes were empty as he met Dave's gaze. "She was a man," he said, his voice barely audible. "All this time, 30 years, I've been married to a man who was born a man." Dave shook his head in disbelief. "And because of that," he trailed off, his voice strained. "I don't know what came over me," Frank admitted, his hands falling into his lap. "I just lost myself. And then that firecracker went off, and I pulled the trigger involuntarily." "God, Frank," Dave muttered under his breath. "Accident or not," Frank said quietly, his voice breaking, "she's dead, and I'm here. And I'll be here for the rest of my life." Frank was transferred to the county jail, where he would await his trial. The cell was small and gray, an apt place for a man whose soul had died the moment Elizabeth did. On the third day, Detective Lauren Sanford from Homicide came to see him. She sat across from him, opening a file folder. "Mr. Donahue," she began, "I'm investigating the murder of your wife, Elizabeth Donahue." Frank nodded silently, his gaze vacant. "Do you admit to shooting her?" she asked. "Yes," Frank replied, his voice empty. "Can you explain how it happened?" Frank stared into space for a long moment, struggling to gather his thoughts before he spoke. "I found out the truth about her past. I was shocked, angry. I drew my weapon. I don't know why. I wasn't going to shoot, but then a firecracker went off outside, and I—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Are you saying it was an accident?" the detective pressed. "Yes," Frank nodded. "But that's no excuse. Nothing can justify what I did." The detective jotted something down in her notebook. Did your wife threaten you? Assault you? No. Frank shook his head. She was just trying to explain, and I couldn't handle the truth. Detective Sanford wrote something else down, then closed her notebook. Mr. Donahue, you will be charged with murder. Given the circumstances and your testimony, the prosecutor may consider manslaughter. But I must warn you, even so, the punishment will be severe. I deserve it, Frank said quietly, his voice a whisper of resignation. Every second. Are you remorseful? She asked, looking at him intently. Every second, Frank answered, tears welling in his eyes. But that doesn't change anything. She's dead, and I'm here. And that's how it's going to be for the rest of my life. Detective Sanford stood, gathering her papers. Before leaving, she turned back to him. One more question, Mr. Donahue. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, what would you do? Frank sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. I would have listened to her. I'd give her a chance to explain. And I would never, ever have picked up a gun. The detective nodded, then turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she looked over her shoulder. You know, Mr. Donahue, sometimes the worst prisons are the ones we build ourselves, in our heads, in our hearts. She left, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts. He stared at his hands, the hands that had held Elizabeth for 30 years and had now taken her life. Outside the prison walls, life in Oak Ridge went on. People whispered, discussing the tragedy. Some condemned Elizabeth for her deception. Others condemned Frank for his cruelty. But most people simply mourned two ruined lives. Robert Clark stood at his sister's grave, holding a bouquet of white roses, her favorite flowers. After the funeral, he left town, taking with him the final chapter of a story that had begun so long ago. The story of two brothers, one of whom had always known he was born in the wrong body. In his cell at the county jail, Frank Donahue sat on the edge of his bunk, holding the only picture he was allowed to keep, their wedding photo. Elizabeth smiled in her white dress. Happy, beautiful, real. Always real. Only now did Frank realize what that really meant.